Good afternoon, everyone. I can feel the excitement in the room for this in-person discussion because the topic just really could not be more urgent than it is now. So we're all super excited, and thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased and honored to welcome you here for one of the signature events of the 21st Century China Center. We gather here to pay tribute to Ambassador Robert Ellsworth, a highly respected public servant, a patriot, and a national treasure. Bob made great contributions to policymaking, diplomacy, and private business. He also played a pivotal role in the founding and early development of this very 21st Century China Center, now one of the most prominent voices in informing policy discussions on China and U.S. China relations. Actually, we were just working on our strategic plan at GPS, and everyone we talked to about GPS mentioned the China Center. So it's very, very well known, a crown jewel of GPS and UC San Diego. And we owe the success in part to Bob's persistence and vision. Since 2013, the Ellsworth Lecture Series has been a highly respected platform for discussing Asia-Pacific affairs, featuring renowned expert statesmen, including today's distinguished speaker, Susan Thornton. And we're immensely proud of the center's achievements, and we owe a great deal of thanks to Susan Shirk and her team for their efforts. As we celebrate the success of Ambassador Ellsworth's vision, we must extend our deepest gratitude to Reverend Eleanor Ellsworth, who's with us here today. And Dr. Z.Y. Lee, Bob's friend and former colleague, who's also with us here today. Their generous support has made this lecture series possible. So thanks again for being here, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to our very own Susan to introduce the rest of today's program. Thank you.
Well, it's just wonderful to see all of you here this afternoon. So many friends of Bob and Eleanor Ellsworth, and so many good friends of the School of Global Policy and Strategy and the 21st Century China Center. As Carolyn said, Bob Ellsworth was really had a kind of formative vision for the 21st Century China Center, which of course is not just a research center, but also a think tank trying to contribute to the improvement, the stabilization of U.S. China relations, which is a mission that's all the more important today than it was in the first days when Bob and I would have lunches discussing how to create this center. So I was so grateful to his mentorship and friendship, and all of us were, and we certainly miss him tremendously. So I want to now turn it over to Li Jungyuan, who is a very good friend of Bob and Eleanor Ellsworth, who had some business projects with Bob here in San Diego. He's from China. He was a mathematician. He studied at MIT. Then he went into finance and business and a number of very interesting business projects in Shanghai, also in Hong Kong. And now he's one of those wonderful people, some of my very best friends, who have one leg in China and one leg in the United States. And that's not such an easy place to be nowadays, but it's really so important. So he'll give a few remarks about Bob. And then Eleanor, the Reverend Eleanor Ellsworth, who is so loved by this community, so respected. And one of the best things about this annual lecture is that Eleanor comes back from Maryland, where she lives now, and we all get to see her, which is really great. So she'll also make some comments, and then I will introduce Susan Thornton. Chung Yuan.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure and honor to have sponsored the Bob Ellsworth Memorial Lecture Series ever since its beginning. I'm very pleased and thankful to Professors Susan Shirk, Peter Cowie, and others at the GPS to have procured such a group of prominent speakers with topics focusing on Sino-U.S. relationship over the years. Bob is a dear friend of mine, and almost each and every time when I was in La Jolla, Bob and I spent time having intellectually stimulating and engaging exchanges. And I was enlightened by him from time to time. And in particular, I was so grateful that Bob enabled me to understand and appreciate what America is all about. I have missed Bob dearly, and I'm so glad to see my dear friend Eleanor today again. Finally, I would like to take the opportunity to welcome Susan Thornton, a distinguished diplomat and public servant, to come to deliver today's lecture. Thank you all very much.
Hello, everyone. My message is very simple. This is fantastic to have you all together. I haven't been here in 3 years, and I'm kind of overwhelmed with seeing faces that mean a lot to me and having conversations. And I can tell you for a fact that this would please Bob very much. I don't know how it works on the other side, but if I can imagine, there might be a big smile. And he's saying, get on with it, Eleanor, we want to hear Susan talk. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who participates in this fantastic school, and in particular, those who have supported the 21st Century China Center. It certainly has the soul of Bob in there somewhere, as we've noted, and I am impressed over and over again with the leadership of this place. So I echo what everybody has said. I say thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan Shirk, my dear friend, right now.
Well, it's really a great privilege and honor to welcome Susan Thornton here to the School of Global Policy and Strategy. Susan has had a long and distinguished career as an American Foreign Service diplomat. She has served in Russia, Central Asia, China, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other places as well. She, what's most recently, she was acting Assistant Secretary of State in the East Asia Pacific Bureau in the Trump administration until 2018. And now she has retired from the Foreign Service, but like other people I know who are retired. She's not really retired because she is very busy at the Sci Center at Yale Law School, at the Foreign Policy Institute, where she's in charge of the Asia program. And what am I forgetting, Susan? What? Brookings. She's she's also a fellow at Brookings Institution. So she lives in Maine, but she's on the plane a lot to Washington and remains a very influential voice in the debate on U.S. China policy. You know, for quite a few years, we've had this bipartisan consensus which has on the China threat. And there really hasn't been as much debate on what is the best way for the United States to handle the China challenge in a way that will be good for America and for the rest of the world. And Susan Thornton is one of the people who has really been articulating important questions and a vision of how U.S. policy could manage relations with China. So I'm very excited to hear her today. So thanks so much for coming.
Susan set a tall order for me, and I don't think that I can come close to meeting it, but I am going to talk a little bit about U.S.-China relations today. In the announcement about this talk, there was a question put forward about how to manage the post-Cold War transition with China and whether it is too late for a good outcome. This may have struck some of you as a little bit dramatic. Last week, a Gallup poll came out that said that fully 50% of Americans consider China to be the greatest enemy of the United States, which is a skyrocketed number from where we've been just a few years ago. And that's also pretty dramatic, I think. Senator Chuck Schumer said at a recent conference in Germany that was supposed to be devoted largely to trying to accomplish the formidable challenge of getting Vladimir Putin's troops out of Ukraine. He said, the transatlantic alliance must work together to confront the Chinese Communist Party, the most powerful autocratic force on earth. And he accused China of continuously escalating its aggression against the West. Kristen Gillibrand, the other senator from New York, recently told a radio audience that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is an autocrat, quote, bent on world war. Marco Rubio warns that China is as great a threat as the Soviet Union ever was, if not an even greater one. And Nikki Haley, in announcing her bid for the presidency coming up, said China's dictators want to cover the world in communist tyranny, and we're the only ones who can stop them. That is all very dramatic. I think if someone came down from another planet to Earth tomorrow, they would be quite puzzled by this situation. Maybe you guys are puzzled. I have been puzzling over this for the last 5 years as U.S.-China relations have turned from predictably kind of constructive and stable to seemingly overnight this kind of contest of adversity and enmity. And it's easy to understand for me how during this time, Russia became a target of US and Western hostility because, after all, Putin audaciously invaded his neighbor, started bombing maternity hospitals, and has threatened nuclear war several times, and his unthinkable terror is still ongoing. But why are Americans now increasingly agreed in seeing China as America's greatest enemy? Is it because of the spy balloon? Is it the repression of Chinese minorities, as in Tibet or as in Xinjiang concentration camps? The national security law in Hong Kong, or possible invasion of Taiwan? Militarization of outposts in the South China Sea? Maybe it's that some people believe that China has unleashed COVID-19 on the United States, although I think even the US intelligence agencies that support the lab leak theory don't think that it was done on purpose. Some blame China for not better controlling precursor chemicals that it ships to Mexico, where drug cartels synthesize fentanyl that kill tens of thousands of Americans each year. Some blame China for the hollowing out of our industrial heartland, which is something that actually began in the 1970s when we did have a lot of blame aimed at Japan. But still, specific US businesses and industries have been hurt by unfair Chinese competition and outright theft. And maybe some of you in the audience could even testify to some of that. This is a long list. And I've left out a lot of things because each week seems to uncover a new area of concern. Of course, many of these areas, if not all of them, are legitimate concerns and need to be addressed. But the problem is today they are not being addressed. Things are so bad between our two countries that we have more communication with Russia right now than we do with China, which is astonishing. In the worst of times during the previous administration, which I was privileged to serve in, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, could hold a call about each side's military intentions that effectively allayed dangerous Chinese suspicions. And today, that is not happening. Our defense secretary's calls go unanswered by his counterpart in Beijing, who, the new counterpart, is under US sanctions. President Biden is not able this week to get a call through to President Xi Jinping. This is a very dire situation. I'd like to establish a kind of a common baseline for our conversation because I know we're going to have a chance for question and answers later. So just a few points about China and U.S. China relations. China is very important. It's not as important as the United States, I would submit, and I think we're still far ahead in terms of influence, capability, capacity, dynamism, et cetera. I think we are far too worried about that and anxious about that. But China is the most populous country, second largest economy, second largest military, has borders with more countries than any other nation on the planet, is the largest, this is important, producer, consumer, and importer of food. It's the largest consumer of electricity. It consumes twice as much electricity as the United States does. Largest importer of fossil fuels, largest emitter, of course, of CO2 emissions, and the largest exporter and trading partner to more than 120 countries. And it's a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a veto. It is the second largest holder of US Treasury bonds after Japan, which is a recent change. So bottom line, China affects all of us every day on this small blue dot that we call Earth, and we cannot avoid it. Second point is that US-China relations have always been pretty turbulent, I would say. It's a fairly short history, but in the 19th century, we had trade with China, but then we had involvement in the Opium Wars, in the carving up of Chinese concessions. There was the Boxer Rebellion, among other things. We had a US open door policy at the turn of the century, but we also had tons of Chinese immigration to this country in the 19th century, followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s when we cut off Chinese immigration to the United States for the next 60 years. We didn't repeal that until 1943 during World War II, when we had an alliance, albeit a fraught alliance to some extent, with China during World War II to fight against the Japanese aggression in that theater. After that, we had the Communist Revolution, the Civil War, siding with the Republicans as they fled to Taiwan. We had the Korean War where we fought China, the Vietnam War with Chinese involvement there against on the other side, and estrangement basically, and very difficult relations, including efforts to undermine China's governance during the period from 1949 to 79. After the normalization in 79, of course, we had cooperation against the Soviet Union, which was part of the rationale for the normalization. But then we had the Tiananmen massacre. We had the Taiwan Strait crisis in 95, 96, the bombing of the embassy in Belgrade in 99, the 2001 collision of planes over Hainan Island, et cetera. You get the picture. This is not, an easy state of affairs by any stretch. So it's over this time that China has frequently charged the United States with trying to undermine their government's stability through our support for various actors in China and for our desires for a so-called peaceful evolution, 和平演变. And the US during this time has come to believe, maybe more recently, that China was abusing our openness, and not just for development, but to build up its military, to challenge us, and to displace US economic dynamism and position in the world. So these two narratives are the thing that we're really now seeing come to the fore, I think. And both of them are being exaggerated for political purposes. But of course, each of these two narratives in the respective countries has a kernel of truth behind it. And I think, we see open talk in the US about seeing the Chinese Communist Party onto the ash heap of history. Chinese officials talk openly now of US and Western decline and decay. It is going to be very hard with these kinds of statements and this kind of rhetoric to go back to what some of us in the room remember was a constructive relationship, a time when, we had suspicions about each other. We had a lot of differences. We were skeptical, but we could work together. And I think it's important to sort of keep in mind this history of turbulence when we get depressed, the way I have been for the last couple of years about the direction of the relationship, because we've gone through very many trials and tribulations before. So it's helpful to remember that. Third point, China has a lot of challenges. This is something I think that maybe people in Washington don't have enough of an appreciation for, and maybe leads them to over-exaggerate, the fear of China or the strengths of China. We hear about a lot of these challenges that China faces: the declining birth rate, pollution and environmental degradation, slowing economic growth is a big problem. Inequality in China is causing a lot of concerns and problems. China has this centralized authoritarian political system, which is becoming more centralized and more authoritarian. Legitimacy is a major source of concern for the ruling party. It leans very heavily on ideology, on performance in the economy, and on nationalism to maintain its legitimacy. But it is a constant source of worry, and I would say even paranoia on the part of the Chinese government. So taking all of that into consideration, I think we need to not panic about where we are with China. Robert Ellsworth's obituary in the New York Times, after outlining his many accomplishments and his various jobs in government, including as a loyal staff member of the Nixon administration, noted that he broke with prevailing Republican views over both the Vietnam War at the time of his government service and also the 2003 invasion of Iraq because, quote, he believed a realistic assessment of American interests trumped Republican ideology. That's the quote in the paper. Trumped Republican ideology, however well-intentioned, unquote. And I believe a realistic assessment of American interests should dictate a change to the current approach to China by the US government. I'm not pro-China, I'm pro-America. Served for more than 30 years, various US government positions, and based on a cool-headed assessment of the realities on the ground and the workability of our current strategy, I reluctantly conclude that American interests are going to be ill-served if we continue down this path. So clearly this is up for debate, and I welcome questions and will not be offended. If you want to take an opposite position, I have these discussions in Washington all the time. You'll certainly hear from Democrats in Washington that the strategy is working, and you'll hear from Republicans in Washington that it is not working. The question that is, in my view, not asked enough is, what is the benchmark we are using to measure success? In the most benign characterizations of current U.S.-China relations, Washington policymakers insist that the U.S. and China are engaged in a global military, diplomatic, economic, and influence competition. But even that more reasonable sounding characterization, it begets obvious unanswered questions, like a global competition for what end? Should we get countries on our side? Should we be reshoring manufacturing jobs from China to the US? Is that the measure? Slower Chinese economic growth, is that what we're going for? Collapse of the Chinese political system, some people in Washington definitely have that on their mind. What does success look like and who will benefit? What collateral damage will such a competition produce? And how will the real existential challenges of today's humanity and today's America be met amid such competition? I think people should ask this question because it's important. I recently heard a US administration official say, well, we're not going to get into what the goal is of this competition. That seems to me fairly irresponsible. This is important. One columnist said glibly that the point of the competition with China is to win. I mean, sorry, but that's not a sufficient answer to a serious question. That the future of our children depends on us getting right. But I am very sensitive, given my long government service, to the difficulties of the man in the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt called it. I don't want to dwell on criticisms. We need to focus today on what we should do and try to articulate a vision that can durably animate a sensible American approach to China going forward. And some will say that the US and China are on this inevitable collision course. I've had debates with John Mearsheimer and others. In Graham Allison's words, he says we're destined for war. I think that this neglects the agency of the actors involved, and it doesn't take enough account of how the world has changed and is changing. In my view, the real problem we're dealing with has really only tangentially to do with China. As Charles Kupchan at the Council on Foreign Relations has written in his book called No One's World, I believe we're moving into an era of multipolarity in the global system, and the US is clinging, unsurprisingly, to the post-Cold War unipolar order. And I think many policymakers have seen this change coming since the 1990s, and maybe Susan can talk about her time in the Clinton administration. But there were efforts made to remake as much of the the kind of rising rest, as they're called, referred to, in the image of the U.S. and its allies as quickly as possible, so that the international system, as this transition from unipolarity to multipolarity happens, so that international system would continue, but under perhaps a more pluralistic, less Western-centric kind of leadership. Not abdication of U.S. leadership, but more say for the rising rest. And that was, I think, a good idea. I mean, it makes sense. It seemed to work for a time. Democracy was on a roll. Market capitalism was flourishing in the 90s, at the so-called end of history that Francis Fukuyama wrote about. But I think one question that historians will have to grapple with is whether it would have worked better if the U.S. had not gotten pulled into 20 years of sort of global war on terror in South Asia and the Middle East. I think we missed a lot of opportunity there to try to reshape the order in a way that would have been more cemented by the time we got to now. But I think the clock has run out, unfortunately, on this effort. We're here now. We're seeing the rising powers, and the tide is already changing. And these other rising powers, especially China, haven't been bound tightly enough into that system, or not as tightly as we would have hoped anyway. So Russia's actions, especially in Ukraine, and China's more aggressive foreign policy are two clear manifestations of us sort of not having achieved everything that we wanted to achieve to cement these powers into the so-called international rules-based system. And so I think we have two big problems in dealing with China now. One is actually grappling with this set of realities and coming up with a strategy to handle it in the best way possible, in the maximizing US interests. The other is the narrative problem. And I think that problem involves how to tell Americans that, well, we've been a unipolar superpower for 30 years and operated with very few constraints on our power in the international system, and now we're going to have to sort of have less free hand in the world, less constraints, and there are others in the system that don't agree with us, and so they think they should have a say, so we're not going to just be able to have this free hand. I think that, as you can probably tell, that's not a very winning political narrative for Americans, and that's to some extent an explanation for what we see in the political arc around our foreign policy right now. I don't really have an answer for this second problem, the narrative. I don't have an answer for any problems. I'm just up here trying to start a conversation, but this narrative problem is really a difficult one. I think it's the more hard problem. These are two hard problems. How can we create a unified, positive, national vision for American purpose in a multipolar world? In the current divided political climate in Washington, I think a realistic narrative that serves America's long-term interests in this respect is very hard to forge in good times, which these may not be in terms of the divisions that we see. China could have done more to help with this problem of ours. They may not have been motivated to help with this problem, but China could have been more consistent in stating and showing that it would not challenge US leadership of the global system. As it did, actually, before Xi Jinping's ascension to the general secretary role of the Chinese Communist Party. And Susan and I were discussing this at lunch today, and I remember being in the embassy in Beijing and talking to one of the strategists for, at that time, President Hu Jintao about his slogan, China's peaceful rise. And there's a lot of debate and scholarship around that, but it reflected this recognition on the part of some in China that China needed to be quite humble in its approach to the outside world because of its size and scale and because of how it would be perceived as a threat as it rose. I think now Chinese leaders do say this, that they're not out to challenge the U.S. position in the world, but nobody in Washington believes it, and China is clearly challenging elements of the international system, so that belies its statements. On the first question, what should we do with China in the place we find ourselves now? I think that there is an answer that's not as difficult maybe as the narrative question, and less dire or less damaging to U.S. interests than people would think. What does China want? China wants to be seen as a responsible international player. It wants to be respected. It does not want the responsibility of managing the international system. I feel quite confident in that. And maybe others have another view, but they've seen the problems that can entail, and they're not really looking to take that on. China wants to be connected to the rest of the world and to modernize. Yes, they are suspicious of foreigners and they're paranoid about security and outside influences, but I don't think China will be able to go back, turn its back on its interconnectivity with the rest of the world. China wants to be powerful, to have a world-class military, to have its interests respected. It certainly wants Taiwan to be brought under the control de facto of the government in Beijing. And yes, China cares about sovereignty and wants to rule China as it sees fit without external interference. But actually, I think this kind of mantra about sovereignty is not, I think Chinese leaders realize it's not realistic in its extreme sort of principled stand, and that actually their attitude towards sovereignty is a lot more malleable than we commonly think. And we see this in many examples. The sensitivity, I think, in Beijing about sovereignty kind of ebbs and flows with the perceptions of security threats, domestic politics in China, and other factors. But I don't think it's an insurmountable obstacle for doing more with China in the international system, and it certainly should not be a casus belli between the United States and China. I think we've worked to bring China into the international system, led by the United States, made great strides in that. Some say China hasn't gone far enough, and that's true. But I say it's probably gone a lot farther than Deng Xiaoping ever thought it would. I wrote about this in a chapter for the China questions too, but others like Ian Johnston at Harvard have done a lot of work on looking at China's integration into the international system. And I would argue that it's an unanticipated success and that historians will view it as such. China accepts basically the US designed, UN-led system. It accepts the legitimacy of most of the rules. It has adopted its system to mirror the global economy set up by the US. Of course, its implementation is not perfect. We have a lot of problems in trade. We had those, decades ago. We'll continue to have them decades from now. By the way, we have a lot of problems with our EU allies and other partners around the world on trade issues, and we'll continue to talk about those for a long time. And I know I said the tide is already turning to multipolarity, and it is, but China is also going to change. And I think we sometimes look out at the world and believe that, time has stopped, the deadline has passed, we didn't make it, and that's it. I mean, this will continue, this process in China of change. I have a lot of faith in the Chinese people to continue to push for change. I think they know what they want, and they're going to keep moving China forward in a way that will eventually see us more convergent on a lot of these issues. Of course, we're disappointed about the areas where China is still outside the system. China is getting strong enough now to resist adherence to these areas. But my argument would be that stopping the international system from fracturing should be the primary strategic goal for U.S. interests going forward. And by fracturing, I mean this move to a new Cold War that we see happening before our eyes. You know, we could maintain U.S. leadership of a non-fractured of a non-fractured global system, but we could probably only keep the system together and maintain a significant leadership role if we move to accommodate to some extent, the rising rest. And this is already being talked about, maybe not in Washington by politicians, but by everyone else who deals in the international system. But we would especially have to accommodate, of course, China, because it's the most important, biggest actor among the rising rest in the international system. So what accommodations would China seek? What kind of changes would we have to consider? It would certainly seek to impose constraints on our areas of unconstrained action in the unipolar era. Some of these are outside, actually, the current international system that we call the rules-based order, but are U.S. preferences backed by our hegemonic power, as the Chinese would say. And others are areas of kind of persistent or emerging disagreement within that international system. So in closing here, and I don't know how I'm doing on time, I'll just touch on two of the most important and controversial issues. The first is territorial integrity. This really means Taiwan. Recently, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang called Taiwan the core of the core interests of China. That's a hint, folks. I wonder whether Washington is understanding Chinese signaling here. But it is an attempt to make Chinese red lines crystal clear. And we can certainly discuss this more in the Q&A, but I think this is an area that will have to be addressed because I believe that Taiwan is really the only casus belli in the U.S.-China relationship that I can imagine. We can say more about that. Would the U.S. have to somehow give up Taiwan in order to accommodate China, or would Taiwan have to submit to Beijing in order to make this kind of thing work in a new international system? I don't think so, actually. I think China wants respect more than anything, and Taiwan right now is a constant finger poking in China's chest. But I think this is not necessarily the way things need to be, and I think that that kind of dynamic can be changed. And if it was changed, if it was not the finger poking, if it was not the sort of flagrant, in-your-face kind of issue that Beijing has constantly now in the recent period had to deal with, I think this issue would not be urgent for Beijing. It's not an issue of international principles or rules. I think it's an issue of face, national psychology, and identity politics. And the US, I hope, will start understanding it as such, or I do worry there will be a conflict. There were similar issues at work, I would argue, in Putin's mind, no doubt, before his invasion of Ukraine, and we need to learn to take these kinds of things, I think, seriously, even if we think they have no merit, which is fine. We can think they have no merit, but it doesn't mean you can ignore the realities that are likely to unfold given that situation. The second issue is the question of sovereignty, and here, the most neuralgic issue, I would argue, is the U.S. unilateral sanctions that are unilateral sanctions imposed on other countries, but certainly on China in this case, outside of UN Security Council approval. And this is an ever-expanding trend that I think is unsustainable, particularly for maintaining a non-fractured international system, but also for dealing with China within it. And so I think China has a lot of support in its disdain for these unilateral sanctions out there in the world that maybe we're not completely conscious of. And certainly others in the developing world and other countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and other, Russia, of course, are very much in China's camp on this. I think it's a problem that our political system appears to be kind of addicted to these sanctions. And I hope that more Americans will start to ask how they can get lifted, who are they benefiting, what impact are they having, have they been successful, and why can we not do sanctions within an internationally kind of accepted rubric to get back to doing it that way. You know, I'm a former diplomat. I understand it's easier to work in small formats, the G7, with like-minded countries. Things go much faster. We can all agree quickly. Cycle in the U.S. We need to go fast to get things done. But it's difficult to deal with people we have differences with. A lot of people in Washington say that talking to China is a waste of time. I am totally sympathetic to all of these arguments. But I think these two areas should be discussed, can be negotiated over. And if we take this kind of a pragmatic approach, we can keep the current international system from breaking apart, which is to our obvious benefit. And I think in the face of current global uncertainties with a lot of instability in the economy, in the security situation, supply chains, international global threats, you know, this should be a decision that for the long-term strategic interests of the country going forward we can take. It would, of course, require a lot of bravery and leadership, but I think it maximizes our chances for a positive outcome, preserves our optionality, which is really important and is in keeping with our values and our interests. So I hope that we can go down a path like this before it is, as the announcement said, too late. Thank you for listening, and I'm very anxious to hear your questions.
Well, that was wonderful, by the way, and gives us really a lot to think about. You're unusual in our Foreign Service in having served in Russia and in China and have, you know, background in both systems. So how do you look at the China-Russia relationship now? I mean, do you think that there's broad support for Russia's position in the Ukraine inside China, or do you think that Xi Jinping kind of stands alone in this point of view? And how do you think this is going to turn out? Do you think that right now China hasn't given tangible aid to Russia, but do you think if Russia is losing the war, that China will step up and assist Russia, and what will be the consequences of that?
It's a great question. It's so complicated. So clearly Xi Jinping feels very comfortable, or used to feel very comfortable, with Vladimir Putin. He's met him 40 times, I think, in the 10 years that Xi Jinping was in power so far, and is seemingly going to be going there again to meet him again. They have a lot of common thinking with respect to the international system, the U.S. and the West, the attitude toward the U.S. hegemony and these kinds of things, about external interference in their internal. So they have a lot of sort of common thinking. I don't think that the Russia-China relationship is ever going to be one of an alliance or anything like that. And I think Xi Jinping is probably regretting that joint declaration that he did with Vladimir Putin during the Winter Olympics, and then 2 weeks later, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. I just think that was an unpleasant surprise to Xi Jinping, and he probably felt used, and he was used, let's be clear. So, it's not a relationship like the U.S. has with Europe, where we're like-minded and we're understanding one another. It's a very transactional, I think, relationship. So on Ukraine, the Chinese have a very complicated hand to play. Inside China, opinion is split, is my understanding. I mean, I haven't been there in 3.5 years. I'm going next week, but it's hard to know. But even though the state media seems to be really kind of pushing Russia's propaganda line, a lot of opinion inside China is pretty appalled at what the Russians have done. And so the Chinese leadership has to deal with that. And I think they're mostly trying to walk a kind of a fine line and keep their options open as much as possible. They'd like, I think, to see the war end, but they don't want to risk, getting too deeply involved in trying to make that happen. And I don't know if they think they have the influence or the ability or the power there to do much about getting Putin out of Ukraine. But certainly they were, the number one trading partner of both Russia and Ukraine before the war. I don't think they can possibly be supportive of this gambit by Putin to do this. They've been very clear that they, have strong feelings about territorial integrity, but on the other hand, they have a lot of empathy, I guess, for Russia's position with respect to its security concerns. And they see a similar kind of larger kind of trend line with respect to what the U.S. and its allies are doing in China with respect to Taiwan. So that's the parallel, I think.
So given this big surprise of China's negotiating Iran and Saudi Arabia, which came as a surprise to everyone, I think. Does that suggest to you that even though its proposal for a peace plan between Russia and Ukraine looked pretty anodyne, pretty feeble, do you think there's a possibility they could actually do that?
I have to laugh because today I've been getting all kinds of emails from colleagues saying, do you think Xi Jinping will fly from Moscow to Kiev and broker a deal? And I would be the first person to stand up and raise my hand and support that kind of an effort on the part of Xi Jinping. I will be shocked if it happens. I think the Iran-Saudi deal, it is surprising because China has not wanted to get itself mixed up in mediating among countries with which it has interests, that could be compromised by sticking its neck out in this kind of mediator role. So clearly, though, it's in Chinese interest to see Iran and Saudi Arabia sort of dust over the hatchet, if not bury it. I think it's not buried, but anyway, it's being papered over for the moment. It definitely helps China. Certainly is good for, I think, pretty much everyone to see that happen. So even though there were some grudging remarks about China's influence increasing in the Middle East, I think that was a good thing. And we were always trying to convince China to do these things earlier when we were, trying to do sort of China's responsible stakeholder in the international system. We were begging them to do this kind of thing. So, maybe if we're thinking about things in a sort of stepping back from the 50,000-foot level, it's just a matter of timing being off. Maybe China could have been doing some of these things but wasn't ready then, and maybe if things had gone differently in U.S. China relations, we would be doing different things together now. So I don't know, but I'm skeptical about China brokering a deal in Ukraine. but I wish they do. I hope they do.
Okay, the floor is open. Susan Zhao has a microphone back there. And, oh, you have a microphone too. Okay, hands up again. No, I always ask a woman first. Actually, my husband, Sam, told me it's a really important principle. Doesn't mean you only ask women to speak, but it's a good idea to ask a woman first. So, come on, ladies. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be very brave because I usually just go home and think about everything. I'm not going to stand up. I'm tall enough. I'm just wondering how do you broker a deal with Taiwan and the United States right now? I hear what you're saying, that we need to appreciate, like, this is a trigger for them. But what are we, like, if we took off the sanctions, you know, in back rooms, because no one really understands all the sanctions going on if you're just a normal person, which I am. So if we just back off that and say, I just don't, I want a solution from you, I guess, is what I'm saying.
We haven't managed to get it for 40 years, but I will give it to you tonight. No. No, I think what we have to be very concerned about is this militarization of the Taiwan problem, right? So in Washington, for some reason, and maybe it has to do with the interregnum of the Trump administration, which didn't, you know, I mean, a lot of people in the Trump administration hadn't had a lot of experience in managing this issue. It's extremely complicated. There's a lot of subterranean texts and Talmuds and other things that you have to pay attention to. And it got into a very militarized kind of a handling during the Trump administration, and it's been difficult to get it back into a political, diplomatic track. I don't think, you know, all the talk now about Taiwan, and especially because of the invasion of Ukraine, has turned to this military invasion scenario. We're talking about war constantly in the Taiwan Strait. And I mean, if you remember from 2008 to 2016, we almost never talked about Taiwan in U.S. China relationship at all. So that just goes to show you that, you know, something's happened here. A couple things happened. It's clear sort of what's happened. It's mostly political stuff, and it's hard to handle. But military deterrence is not going to work in Taiwan. The reason is because deterrence works if the sort of aggressor believes that either they will pay too high a cost or their effort will not be successful. But the core of China's interests, they don't care how much it costs, and they don't even care if it will be successful. If they have to go because they think they're going to lose this, that Taiwan is going to leave their grasp somehow, that the U.S. is going to create a security threat in Taiwan that China cannot abide, that, you know, whatever else they think. And again, it's not the merit of their perception. It's just the perception. So you have to know what they're really sort of afraid of and thinking. And if they think that, they will go. It's not a matter of how many missiles we have on Taiwan. So I'm very puzzled by the fascination and overemphasis on military deterrence, because if you don't do something besides that, you'll end up causing the thing that you're trying to deter. And so that's not a solution. That's what we shouldn't be doing. And I know you asked for a solution, but we could start by stopping doing what we're doing now. And then the second part of it is obviously we have to have some diplomacy. Now, there's all kinds of complications around this because we're not supposed to negotiate with China over Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. But we've managed it for 40 years like that. And I'm sure we could, you know, find a way to talk to China about Taiwan, find a way to make sure Taiwan knows what we're doing. I think Taiwan would be relieved, frankly, because I think they're very worried. I mean, they're going to be, it's their home that's going to be destroyed in all of this. It's not going to be ours. It's not going to probably be mainland China. So, you know, that I think is extremely important to try to get back to this situation where China can be comfortable that Taiwan is not leaving, and they have, you know, massive trade with each other. There's so many Chinese living in Taiwanese living in mainland China, et cetera. So I think, you know, getting back to sort of the stable status quo for an extended period of time and giving people satisfaction that we're not trying to change it is a way of doing it, and it could be done. There are other people like Doug Paul in the audience that probably could speak to this even more eloquent and specifics, but that would be the basic outline.
Okay. Don?
So, I want to agree with Susan. This was wonderful, so thank you very much. I agree with almost everything you said. I'm not quite as sanguine about the intentions of China, and I put that, not China so much as President Xi, and we can all read Susan's book. I want to ask about Taiwan. You mentioned the militarism that's being projected from the U.S. A couple of days ago, Robert O'Brien suggested that if China moved on Taiwan, we would bomb TSMC's fabrication facilities, the semiconductor facilities. I thought that was an extraordinary statement to make. I wondered if you had a reaction to that. And it seems to me totally inconsistent with the way you are talking about, which I agree with, the way to try to proceed with Taiwan. I will say I think it is in President Xi's mind to eventually move in some way to gain much more sovereign control over Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't disagree with the last statement that they would love to move, and I think I said that they de facto control by Beijing over Taiwan is the goal. It's our job to make sure that takes a long time, because as I said, they're changing, and hopefully, I would still say the best prospect for Taiwan is change over time. And on the question of bombing TSMC, you know, I mean, people ask a lot about
TSMC
Oh, yeah, sorry.
is the most important producer of semiconductors in the world.
Right, yeah,
And
Taiwan.
it happens to be in Taiwan, which makes it very complicated.
Yes. But I would say, I mean, a lot of people ask about this so-called Taiwan Silicon Shield. You know, some in Taiwan have said, oh, because we have TSMC, the Chinese won't do X. I think that's a bridge a little bit too far. I mean, I think the notion that the U.S. is going to bomb a facility in Taiwan if the Chinese are, you know, well, I think it gets into this whole mindset about thinking about deterrence, you know, to try to get the Chinese to think they're not going to get it even if they invade. I don't think this is the object. This is not the objective of the Chinese action. Is not TSMC or semiconductors. I mean, they need semiconductors. They're probably very unhappy that they're not getting them from Taiwan. There could be pressure, but you know, they're not going to invade Taiwan in order to take over TSMC. I don't believe that's a realistic scenario. So I'm sure he was thinking that he was aiming at that, but again, I just don't think that's the way it's going to unfold.
Okay, we have some folks who are tuning in virtually, and Harry has a couple of questions from them.
Certainly. We have a lot of great questions from online, but can't get to all of them because they're all in very different areas. So I'll just ask one quick one about whether current U.S. positions on Taiwan and the free navigation of the South China Sea, whether those are still possible in the budding multipolar world we are entering.
Whether they're still possible. Well, I mean, I think in my talk, I hinted that I think that the situation with Taiwan is unsustainable in its current trajectory if we're going to have a non-fractured system in a multipolar world. But that will take a long time, I still think, to play out, or at least, a medium-term type scenario. South China Sea is probably also going to take a long time to play out, and that gets to the question that was raised about Xi Jinping's intentions and basically China's long-term interests of controlling the waters through which its substantial imports of food and energy flow to China to sustain its economy. I mean, any major power is going to see the fact that they can't control their sea lanes that are the vital vessel or arteries for getting all of the supplies that their economy needs, is going to see that as a security vulnerability. Whether the U.S. could somehow make China comfortable with the U.S. patrolling those sea lanes over time, it's a pretty tall order. I think most of our structural realists, offensive realists, and others in the IR community would probably say nonsense. But could there be some kind of modus vivendi worked out? I would say, it's a reasonable prospect to try to work that out. But it would take, I think it's going to evolve over a long period of time.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Congratulations about your insights. So do you think, is there any possibility that U.S. change the perspective from bilateral relationship into a regional perspective, into a regional relationship? Because let's say right now in Mexico, Canada, as a region, the nearshoring is a key important, one of the most important points right now from the reality. China is going to bring and is bringing a lot of transferring technology to north of Mexico. So do you think there is a possibility to change from bilateral into a regional and build a long-term relationship with Mexico and Canada in much more than a bilateral one? Thank you.
Interesting question.
So you mean China have a relationship with Mexico and Canada?
I think the idea is nearshoring will involve, and it's already happening, that Chinese companies are coming.
Right.
And
Combine the three countries. Yeah. Okay. So I think the U.S. already has a regional strategy, if that's what you mean. And one of the complications of that is that we are trying to prevent China from being a hegemon in its region because its neighbors are afraid of that. So exactly what I was talking about, that as China rises and gets more powerful, it scares its neighbors, and they want the U.S. to balance China in the security sense, right? So that's been at the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example, which is the U.S.'s regional approach to Asia. But I think what you're talking, there was this sense that U.S.-China bilateral was going to be a G2, and we were going to get together and run the international system. And that, of course, did not work out. And I think now what we would need to see, I think U.S.-China bilateral is probably not going to be very productive. So getting more countries in the mix could be helpful. And I think that's what you're getting at, right? That so China can't have its companies coming to the US, but they have good relations with Mexico. They don't have great relations with Canada right now, but those could improve. And so getting more countries to have a sort of plurality in the mix of the US-China relationship is definitely something that I think would make it easier to have a more productive and constructive approach on different things. And there are some people that are working on this. Even the Chinese have written, there's a Chinese that has written an article recently about a sort of a US, EU, China kind of a discussion that would help, the EU being there would kind of be a buffer or moderate the toxicity of the US-China relationship. So I think there are possibilities here. It's hard for other countries to get in the middle of US-China. They're very
We have a trade agreement.
Yeah. You mean the NAFTA agreement?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the question is whether the U.S. is going to try to press Mexico and Canada to, go in a different direction, and how successful would be. I mean, I think the record is mixed on this, of trying to have the U.S. get other countries to do things on trade and follow our line with China, and it's still playing out. I think we'll have to see. But if it's helpful to Mexico, and I think that also is kind of good for the U.S. because we have a lot of problems emanating from Mexico right now. So, I mean, there are ways these things can work out.
Martha.
I've been reading and hearing rumors that there's a timeline for when Taiwan is going to be invaded, and that is 2025. Is that a joke? Is that something you don't know?
Yeah, it's a good question. The discussions about the timeline for an invasion of Taiwan have all come, if I'm not mistaken, from U.S. military personnel appearances before congressional hearings on defense budgets. So, we should look for more sources, more diversified sources on the timeline, I think.
Okay, I think this will be our last question. Margaret.
Thank you. China, of course, it's well known as investing heavily in North and South Pacific, and I'm interested what you make of these recent investments in these very small sovereignties, and what you think the United States response should be.
Oh, it's a really great question. It's also complicated. I mean, there are these very tiny island states all over the Pacific in far-flung places. Some of them in Oceania have traditionally been looked after or helped out, I would say, by like Australia and New Zealand. Of course, we have a compact of free association with several of the states in the Pacific as well, Marshall Islands, et cetera. So we're basically obligated by contract to be responsible for them. And then there are a number of other states at issue. We have been unable to renew our compact of free association. It's been just every time we have to renew it, it's a struggle to get the resources from Congress, for the Department of the Interior. So our part of this responsibility has been neglected pretty tragically over the last few decades. The Australia and New Zealand part of the responsibility has also pretty tragically been very neglected over the last several decades. And these are, nation states with UN votes. And they have profited over the years by trading on the China, Taipei, Taiwan rivalry. So if you recognize China, you get a payoff. 3 years from now, you switch recognitions and you get a payoff from Taipei. Switch back and you get a payoff from China. So these island states have been the subject of this vying competition for diplomatic recognition between the two, Beijing and Taipei. And at one point during Ma Ying-jeou's tenure in Taiwan, there was a truce called, and things were kind of stabilized in this what do they call it?
Yeah.
But the truce broke down when the opposition leader was elected in Taipei as the new authority in Taiwan. So this kind of gives you the backdrop of where we've been on this and why China cares so much about these places, because it doesn't want Taiwan to recognize them. And so we have to see that these islands represent kind of a big interest for China, big interest. Because it's a state that is at play in the diplomatic recognition game. So we've got to up our game. We've got to get resources. We've got to go out there. We didn't. When I was in the Trump administration, there's this thing called the Pacific Island Forum that they have every year that Hillary Clinton went to when she was the Secretary of State, and in the Trump administration, I went as our representative. So that, I was, of course, important and welcomed, but it wasn't, it wasn't at that level. So you gotta do, if you're gonna be out there and trying to maintain global leadership of the international system, you gotta do what you gotta do and get the resources that are needed. And this is like not big money, so we should do better. And I think we are doing better. We've been sending a lot of people out to the Pacific Islands. We're actually getting the compact, I think, re-upped, I hope, so.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone in the audience for these excellent questions. And, there's a lot to talk about. We look forward to your coming back to visit us again in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.